So I want to talk to you today about how to defend science from science deniers by giving scientists and science communicators some better tools to push back. Now, what could be a better tool than scientific evidence? But here's the problem. You don't convince someone who doesn't hold their views based on evidence by providing them with more evidence. That's called the information deficit model, and it doesn't always work. So we need a bit more strategic approach, and I want to start with what the research tells us. Some people are quite worried about something called the backfire effect. You might remember this from a paper by Brendan Nyhan and Jason Riefler in 2010, and it purports to show that by presenting someone with contravening evidence, you can sometimes make things worse and cause them to double down on their mistaken beliefs. It's a perverse effect because by trying to refute someone, we might actually be making them more committed to their mistaken beliefs, which raises a really important question. Are we doing more harm than good by arguing with those who disagree with us? But in recent studies, first by Ethan Porter and Thomas Wood in 2014, and many others since, they've shown that the backfire effect finding couldn't be replicated. And that is great news, because it means that you can't hurt anything trying to convince someone to give up their denialist beliefs. You may not succeed, but the worst that'll happen is that they're going to stay dug in. Your intervention isn't going to make their beliefs harden. In fact, the worst outcome would be if you don't try to change their minds at all and you just walk away. Over the summer of 2019, the journal Nature Human Behavior published a study by Cornelia Beitsch and Philip Schmid, which provided the first empirical evidence to show that we can fight back effectively against science deniers. And they showed us how. The study was done online with 1,770 subjects in the USA and Germany who were first exposed to incorrect scientific information and then immediately corrected. This is obviously a form of debunking, and they found that in a statistically significant number of cases, it worked in getting deniers to give up their false beliefs. But there are two ways of doing it. The first way is perhaps no surprise. It's called content rebuttal, and it's when you're a content expert and the subject is something on which you know the facts. If you're a climatologist and the subject at issue is climate change, go nuts, you got this. You won't necessarily get all of them, but as I said, in a statistically significant number of cases, this works. Now here's the really interesting part of the study, because what about the rest of us who aren't scientists? Here's where the study really helps, because there's a second strategy which has to do not with the content of the denier's beliefs, but with the flawed reasoning scheme that's behind it. This is called technique rebuttal, and it's based on an original insight by Mark and Chris Hufnagel, later developed by cognitive scientists John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski, which shows that all science deniers follow the very same flawed blueprint. They cherry-pick evidence. They believe in conspiracy theories. They rely on fake experts and they denigrate real experts. They engage in illogical reasoning. And then my favorite, they insist that science has to be perfect to be credible, showing that they've never actually done any science. And what Beitsch and Schmid showed is that if you learn these 5 tropes of science denial, you can use them to undercut denialist beliefs. There are some examples in their paper, along with even a few scripts of what to say, and I encourage you to take a look for yourself. But here's the knockout punch. Beitsch and Schmid found that both content rebuttal and technique rebuttal work equally well, and that there's no additive effect, which is even more good news, because it means that even lay people can do this and can be as effective as scientists. You don't need to be a scientist to defend science. But now there's some bad news, because the studies showed that we can only mitigate, not overturn, the effect of exposure to scientific misinformation. Once a population hears a falsehood, there are some of them who will just believe it, even once it's been debunked. No matter how good you are at debunking, at the group level, there's always going to be some lingering negative exposure of scientific misinformation. Which means that the best thing to do is not to allow the deniers to be able to spread their misinformation in the first place. But the worst thing is to walk away when they're doing so. Beitsch and Schmid joke that if you're invited to a debate, say yes, but then cancel at the last minute. if it means that the event will be canceled. But if it's going to be held anyway, then you've got to show up. And the reason is obvious, because you want to keep the audience from hearing that misinformation. Now, of course, as an academic study, there were some limitations with the Bache and Schmid finding. These weren't mistakes or fraud or even negative findings, but just the idea that no one study can cover everything that's relevant to the underlying question. The first limitation of the study, I think, is one of time proximity. The study only dealt with debunking science denial messages immediately after they were heard for the first time by naive subjects. But what about the problem of overturning the beliefs of hardcore science deniers, whose convictions have been set in stone because they've been marinating in scientific misinformation for years? Could content rebuttal or technique rebuttal work on them too? And we don't know, because it wasn't studied. Now, there's one intriguing query along these lines that showed up in a commentary on the study by the eminent cognitive scientist Sander van der Linden, who brought up the issue of pre-bunking, sometimes called inoculation theory. What if you use technique rebuttal, for instance, not to wait until someone had already heard false information, but instead try to intervene beforehand? Maybe you'd say, you're going to hear a conspiracy theory about vaccines. Here's why that's dangerous. Would that work better than debunking? Could we defang the snake? There's some good empirical work out there which shows that this can be effective, and it just makes sense if you think about the primacy effect in psychology. People tend to believe what they hear first. Now, I love this idea of pre-bunking, but even if it works, it doesn't solve the problem of whether it's possible to overturn the beliefs of hardcore denialists, for whom it's way too late to pre-bunk their mistaken beliefs. So my question still stands. Could a hardcore science denier's beliefs be debunked with either content rebuttal or technique rebuttal? A second limitation is that the study was done only online. And I get it. I understand that most studies are done online these days, and I understand why. But still, what about real life? Oftentimes we encounter a science denier in person. Oftentimes it's our brother-in-law across the Thanksgiving table, at least in some interactive form. So another concern here is whether these methods of debunking might work at all, or perhaps work even better face-to-face. But again, this wasn't studied. Now, I think there are answers to these questions. But here we begin to outrun the scientific literature. So what I'm going to report on next is what I learned from the anecdotal literature and from my own practical experience as reported in my new book, How to Talk to a Science Denier. There are many examples in the news media of hardcore science deniers who have changed their minds. But how does this happen? At home, I have a thick file of these stories in a folder on my desk, and I've looked carefully at each one, and I've discovered a pattern. Virtually every hardcore denier who has had their mind changed on a scientific subject has done so after a face-to-face encounter when evidence was presented by someone with whom they had a trusting relationship. Personal engagement is key, and I believe that's because science deniers don't just have an information deficit, they have a trust deficit. It matters crucially who is sharing the information with them and how they're doing it. You convince someone best when they trust you, and you build trust best in person. And here I'd like to tell you two quick stories from the anecdotal literature. The first story is from 2014, when there was a measles outbreak in Clark County, Washington, which is right across the Columbia River from my hometown of Portland, Oregon. There was a pretty heavy anti-vax community there at the time, which may explain why that was where the measles outbreak occurred. In response, Governor Jay Inslee, who is no science denier, sent public health officials down to Clark County to talk with the deniers face-to-face, and it worked. They didn't get everyone, but they got a lot of them. And you can read all about it in a Washington Post story titled, "It Will Take Off Like Wildfire." Just put that in Google, though not right now, and the story will pop right up, and you can read the comments of some of the anti-vaxxers, one of whom changed her mind after a public health official took 2 hours to explain cell interaction to her using a whiteboard. At the end, she said that she felt respected and that he was very factual, while also commenting that he seemed very warm. Now look, I get it, 2 hours, Is that solution scalable? Maybe not, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. For now, what's important to note is simply that if we approach someone in the right way, it is possible to change their mind. A second story, actually this one is my favorite, is about Jim Bridenstine, who was a rock-ribbed conservative member of Congress who gave a speech a few years back on the floor of the US House in which he said all the things that climate deniers usually say on the subject. And then, of course, Donald Trump appointed him to be the head of NASA, because what else are you going to do with a guy like that but make him head of the premier scientific organization in the world that studies climate change? Well, a funny thing happened to Jim Bridenstine at NASA. Within a few weeks, he changed his mind. Not only that, he gave another speech in which he said he'd been wrong, that climate change was real, and that we were the cause of it. When's the last time you heard a politician do that? They asked him why he changed his mind, and he said that he'd read a lot. But I have another theory. I think he finally met all those scientists he'd been demonizing and distrusting all those years. And he found them to be pretty reliable, likable people, after all. Suddenly, he was their boss. He was hanging out with them in the hall and having lunch with them. He knew them by their first name. As with the earlier example, I think it's the face-to-face encounters that built the trust that allowed his beliefs to change. What that shows, I think, is that even empirical beliefs can be tribal. We already know from the work of Jonathan Haidt, Dan Kahan, and others that belief is often shaped by issues of trust, identity, and values. Which community are you in? Does it include any scientists? If not, where are you getting your information from? As it turns out, if you're dealing with hardcore deniers, context matters a lot. It's not that evidence can't be persuasive, it's that you have to approach someone with evidence in the right way after you've built trust with them. Don't insult them or yell at them. Treat them with respect. Stay calm. This is common sense. Michael Shermer had an article in Scientific American where he talked about this years back. The overall point is to listen. Make sure they feel heard and be patient. Even if you can't talk someone out of their beliefs, sometimes you can create a situation where they can talk themselves out of their beliefs. You can change minds if you take the other person seriously and engage with them and begin to have a dialogue. And here I'd like to tell you about one of my personal experiences. In November 2018, I went to a Flat Earth convention. I'll say that again. In November 2018, I flew out to Denver, Colorado, where I spent 48 hours at the Flat Earth International Conference with 650 people who believe that the Earth is flat, that Antarctica isn't a continent, but an ice wall spread out along the perimeter of the Earth to keep the water from falling off because they're not idiots. They believe that the sun, moon, and stars are very close to us, just outside a dome that covers the Earth. And in fact, we've never been to the moon because no rocket ship could get through the dome. They genuinely believe this. Now, I spent the first day, so I bought the ticket, I had the lanyard and the flannel shirt, I fit right in. And I spent the first day with my mouth shut. Actually, my jaw dropped a couple of times, but I didn't say much, I just listened. But then on the second day, I came out as a philosopher of science who just had a few questions, like Columbo just has a few questions. Now, I want to make it clear, I did not lie to anyone about who I was on the first day. The first thing that happened when I walked into register is somebody put his hand on my arm and said, you know, Lee, because it said Lee right there. He said, how did you get into Flat Earth? And I said, well, it's fascinating. Yes, it is. Later in the day, somebody was talking to me and they got a little suspicious and he said, Lee, what are your personal beliefs? And I said, I'm a skeptic. And he said, me too. So I managed to get through the first day. We got to the second day, and then I told them who I was, and I was honest about it. I'm a philosopher of science. I don't believe in flat Earth. I'm not going to talk about Aristarchus. I'm not going to talk about Foucault's pendulum and all the stuff they had a cheat sheet for. I'm going to talk about how you're reasoning. And they thought it was great because they said they were going to convert me. Now, I caught a break here because to a person, all of the flat earthers I spoke with said that their views were not based on faith, but evidence. Good majority of them were evangelical Christians, but they would not maintain that their views were based on faith. They said it was evidence, and then in fact that they were more scientific and skeptical than the scientists. Now, I knew that didn't mean that I should just launch in and start presenting them with scientific evidence. For one thing, I'm not a scientist, can't do content rebuttal. For another, if they hadn't believed the evidence that had been around for the last 2,300 years, why would they suddenly believe it from me? That was just not going to work. They were conspiracy theorists. They thought that every scientist, teacher, astronaut, government official, and airline pilot was in on it, despite the fact that most of them had flown in with a pilot, so they trusted the pilot for that, despite the fact that they were live tweeting the event, even though there was satellite traffic to get, I mean, just think about that for a minute. They already knew all of the standard evidence for around Earth, but they didn't trust the scientists who were sharing it. They thought that all of the evidence was flawed or corrupt. So instead of talking about the evidence, I talked about their reasoning. As a philosopher, I wanted to challenge how they were thinking about the role of evidence. My key question here was one that I catched from Karl Popper. What evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, would convince you to change your mind? And they couldn't answer this, and that was key. It made them think for a moment, and I was happy to just shut my mouth again and let them sit with that discomfort. They had said that their beliefs were based on evidence, but were they really? I was out there trying technique rebuttal before the Bache and Schmidt study had even come out, and in fact, maybe that's why I like the study so much, because confirmation bias apparently works for philosophers too. Anyway, my working theory was that flat Earth, and indeed all science denial, wasn't really based on evidence at all, but on identity and ideology. If so, this meant that no matter what the topic, all denialist reasoning was the same. So if I learned how to talk to a flat earther, I could use what I learned to talk to a climate denier or an anti-vaxxer as well. To me, flat Earth was a great chance to witness science denial in its most elemental form. Of course, I was also concerned with the fact that flat earthers use these conventions to recruit new members. When I was speaking to someone, we usually had an audience, and I didn't want to let any nonsense go unchallenged. Even if I didn't convince my conversation partner, maybe someone else would overhear me pushing back. But I also wanted to take a shot at reaching the hardest of the hardcore. So I like to grab the speakers just after they came off stage, like this. My best conversation was with a guy who had just given a talk about how to recruit people into flat Earth. I waited for the crowd to thin a bit, then invited him to dinner, my treat, where we talked for 2 hours completely alone. He was a very intelligent guy. He was. And he understood my gambit immediately, and he wanted to say what would convince him. But every time he mentioned something like going up in a rocket, which couldn't be done, or flying over Antarctica, which he thought couldn't be done, he immediately took it back because he kept finding one conspiracy theory after another that would flummox it. And by the end, he was frustrated, and so was I. So what you all want to know at this point is, did it work? Neither he nor anyone else I talked to tore off their lanyard and said what a fool I was. But maybe that's not really surprising. They had 649 other people there to reinforce their views, and by the time someone comes to a convention like that, they're probably pretty hardcore themselves. And remember that most of my conversations were a one-off with a stranger. If I'd been smart, I would have followed up. I would have built a relationship, especially with the guy I took to dinner. But still, I hope that I made a difference. Hey, at least I showed up. By listening, I got some folks to listen back, and in the process, I think I built some trust, which is the first step to changing belief. The flat earthers made a big deal of the fact that no physicists had come to their conference to refute them. If it was so easy to do, why weren't they there? They said it was because they were scared, which is absurd, but there's an important message there, which is that if scientists don't show up, or allies of science don't show up, I think we all lose. And consider this, Bache and Schmidt have now shown in a scientific study, in Nature no less, that content rebuttal and technique rebuttal can be effective. So are we going to be science deniers? Are we going to say it's no use talking to these people and just stay home? I don't think that we should. In closing, I'd like to say just a word here about the stakes. and also to think about what the future might look like if we don't get a handle on this problem. It used to be that science deniers existed with the tinfoil hat on the corner handing out the mimeograph sheet, but we sort of ignored them. But what happens now is that science denial is organized, and the guy doesn't need to stand on the corner anymore because they've got the internet. They can recruit thousands, if not millions, of deniers, which we all know. But here's the important point. Why do people do that? Why do they create that kind of disinformation? It's because it serves their interest to do so. Science denial doesn't come out of nowhere. Most science denial is based not on misinformation, but disinformation. Science denial is not a mistake, it's a lie. Science denial is largely the result of an intentionally created campaign of propaganda that's designed to get people to believe false things about science because it serves the interests of the people who created it. Remember Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's brilliant book, Merchants of Doubt. Science denial is strategic. It's not always about money. As we saw during the pandemic, these days science denial is often about political ideology, but the point is the same. Whether the motivation behind the disinformation is economic or political or ideological, the deniers are out there doing someone else's bidding, and most of them don't even realize it. People don't suddenly wake up one day wondering whether there's a Jewish space laser. They don't just occur to them while they're driving to work that maybe there are microchips in their vaccines. They're fed that as disinformation from someone who's benefiting. In the case of microchips, there's a heartbreaking and infuriating story behind this. In April 2020, an article appeared in a publication called the Oriental Review, which said that any future microchips developed in the West would have, any future vaccines developed in the West would have tracking microchips in them, courtesy of Bill Gates, who held patent number 666 on this technology. At the end of the article, it said share on Facebook, share on Twitter, and a lot of people did. By May 2020, a month later, 22% of the American population believed this to be true. Now, I printed up that statistic. It was 44% of Republican voters thought that it was true. But now think about that for a moment. That's just 1 month after the story appeared, and it's 4 to 5 months before Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer or Moderna had any vaccine. But millions of people were already convinced that they were dangerous. Why? What the article did not say was that the Oriental Review is one of 4 English language propaganda arms of the GRU, which is the branch of Russian intelligence that deals with foreign disinformation. Russian trolls made up that story. How many of you knew that before I said it today? 4? I didn't break into CIA headquarters to find this, and neither did they. It was in the Wall Street Journal. But it was a one-day story behind a paywall, and it was never discussed, to my knowledge, on cable news. Ask yourself how many thousands of Americans, or maybe even all million who died of COVID, heard that story and it played some role for them. We'll never know. But if anything could give you empathy for science deniers and encourage you that it's worth your time to talk to them, realize this: most science deniers are victims. They're victims of someone else's lies that they believe as misinformation, but it starts as disinformation. But I want you to realize also that a secondary purpose of disinformation is to get the believers not to trust the truth tellers. That's another reason why it's important to talk to them, to break down that wall of distrust. As I see it, the problem with science denial is three-pronged. We have to think about who's creating the disinformation, who's amplifying the disinformation, and who's believing it. My book deals with the third problem, but I want to think more about the other two. How can we get somebody to stop creating disinformation? Maybe there's no way. How are you going to get the GRU to stop doing that? How can we keep it from being amplified on social media? That problem might not be as hard as we think. A while back, the Center for Countering Digital Hate found that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was created by just 12 people. When liars have, some of whom are still on Twitter, when liars have a microphone, they can do an incalculable amount of damage. So let's think about what we could do to stop that. I recently heard Stephen Lewandowski make a proposal that made a lot of sense. The mis- and disinformation problem at social media companies may not require government regulation of content so much as a demand for transparency. Right now, the algorithms at Facebook and Twitter are black boxes. Who knows what lurks beneath them? And in what sense they're tweaking engagement costs us truthfulness, and we suspect that this is true, but who's seen the algorithms? If there was some way for academics and others outside researchers to get a look at them while shielding the private data of the users, maybe we could do something about this before a whistleblower came forward. But there are other things I think we can do as well. The goal of SciCoP is to debunk and expose people who make outrageous, non-evidential claims. And that's a tremendous public service. But is it enough? Do we just want to be right, or do we want to keep more people from getting duped in the first place? Most of the charlatans surely know that they're cheating. Their minds can't be changed because they don't really believe in telepathy or dowsing or astrology in the first place. They're just making a buck or seeking fame, and maybe that's why it's so delicious to expose them. But what about the people who believe them? We might reach them by poking holes in the claims of the people who've been lying to them, especially if we do it in public. But as we've seen, some are so far down the rabbit hole that merely providing them with the evidence may not be sufficient to change their mind or to keep them from falling for the next scam the next time. 50 years ago, most people trusted scientists, even if they didn't always understand how science worked. But now many people don't. That is, they don't trust scientists, and they still don't understand how science works. And I think that part of that has to rest with us, with scientists and with science communicators, and whether we've done enough to fight back against not only the disinformers' goal of providing false content, but their twin goal, which is raising doubt about whether we should trust the scientists. Think of what they did to poor Dr. Fauci. The goal of disinformation is not just to get you to believe something false, it's to undermine the very process by which scientific theories are built in the first place. I'd like to see a public education campaign built around the idea that the special epistemic status of science is due not to the authority of scientists, but the authority of evidence. We all know this. I think the public needs to know this. To make a scientific claim is to be willing to change one's mind on the basis of new evidence. This is why the work of SciCoP is so important. We take the liars seriously. We actually listen to their evidence, sometimes send out a crew, and when it doesn't measure up, we say so in public. But another part of our job, I think, should be to do more public outreach about how science works, not just about the results of science, but about what I've called the scientific attitude. The idea that science is based not on proof or certainty, but warrant. That what it means to be a scientist is to be able to admit in advance that one's theory could be overturned if the evidence were sufficient, and then to specify exactly what that evidence would be. By the way, people talk about scientific method as if there were some recipe or formula by which you could observe, hypothesize, predict, test, go back to the beginning, that you would get truth at the other end. The thing that I think really makes science special is not a procedure or a method, but the attitude that scientists have. The attitude that I care about evidence, and I'm willing to change my mind based on new evidence. That is a really incredible thing. And by the way, I think that that's something that whether you're a scientist or not, you can believe in. And why don't more science deniers get that message about the scientific attitude, how important it is? That's the real difference between scientists and deniers, I think. For all their skepticism, scientists are wonderfully open-minded. As Carl Sagan once said, science is a balance between these two goals. We must be neither gullible nor intransigent. What makes a denier isn't simply their disbelief in the scientific consensus, nor their lack of accurate empirical information, nor even their poor reasoning ability. It's their attitude, their stubborn conviction that no new evidence is welcome or needed to try to change their minds, because the only people they trust have already told them that they're right. That's it.